you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Mark Weber back on the show. Of course, Mark is a historian, author, and lecturer. He studied in history at the University of Illinois at Chicago, the University of Munich, Portland State University, and Indiana University, where he received an M.A. He's the director of the Institute for Historical Review. Mark, how are you doing this evening?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be on. Good being with you.
Well, thank you for coming back on the show. Well, recently, I guess this article was published or republished. It's based on, I think, on a speech you gave last fall. Why conservatives can't win. So,
right.
Why are conservatives losers?
The short answer is they don't have any consistent principles, at least principles they're willing to fight for. The article, as you can read, it's posted on the UNS Review website, points out that over the years, conservatives have abandoned one position after another. The conservative position, the liberal position of today is the conservative position of 10 years ahead, or the conservative position today is the liberal position of 10 years earlier. Very often that's the case. On issue after issue, conservatives have retreated and abandoned positions, and it's very hard to pin down conservatives on what they actually want to conserve. You ask I ask oftentimes a person who says I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal. Well, what do you mean by that? And very often conservatives will say something like, "Well, I just want individual freedom," or I support the Constitution. But when you press a conservative very often about these issues, it becomes very vague about exactly what they mean by that. And as I point out in the article, in terms of individual freedom, we have many more individual freedoms in many ways than we had 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. Many things which used to be illegal or unlawful are today permitted. I mean, one good example is abortion. Abortion used to be a crime in America. Now it's a so-called right, and the courts have declared that it can't be restricted. At one time, it couldn't be made legal. Now, I'm not talking about whether a particular point of view is correct or incorrect. It's merely that in terms of so-called freedom, there's many more freedoms that we have that we didn't have. 50 years ago, anybody talking about marriage between men and men would have been considered an idiot and a fool or crazy or something. Today, it's considered a right. Now, when conservatives say they want more individual rights, they don't mean that. They mean something else. And this is one of the points I'm trying to make. I make many other points too about highlight other issues that conservatives have retreated on over the years. Now that's one problem. The other is that conservatives have a hard time really articulating what they want. They get what they vote for, but not what they really want. And the kind of America they want is not one that really is dependent on conservative principles. When conservatives are asked what's important, they'll often say, well, we want limited government. But conservatives at the same time, when you ask them, well, what country in the world would you prefer to live in, they never choose countries which have really limited government. They choose countries with even more of an intrusive government that we have in our country. Now, these are just a few examples of why conservatives have trouble sticking with any firm principles over the years and why they lose.
Yes, you make a good point. Today we are swimming in rights, so-called rights.
Right.
But there's very little talk, at least in the public square, about duties and obligations, which, philosophically speaking, in order to have a right, you also must have a corresponding duty, and vice versa. And there's very little talk about that. It's all about, it's very narcissistic, and atomizing.
Well, I agree completely, Tim, but that's my point. That's one of my points, is when you ask a conservative what's important, very often the only answer you'll get is an emphasis on so-called rights. You're absolutely correct. A healthy society has a corresponding relationship between rights and duties. The rights of a society of a person in a society carry with them certain responsibilities, social responsibilities that are incumbent on the individual as a member of that community or society.
You talk about a couple of examples, of course, that you give in the article is things like programs like Social Security, where at one time conservatives would have written this off or criticized it as a socialist program, and now it's become sort of part of the system, and now it's a sacred cow. Now that no one talks about cutting it back or repealing it. The same thing with although there is some talk about the Affordable Care Act, but nevertheless, it seems that now, just because the Supreme Court gave its imprimatur on it, declaring it constitutional, there's no philosophical criticism of that decision. There's they say, well, the Supreme Court has rendered their decision and that's it, despite its constitutional infirmities. So there's no coherence or principle. It's like now it's the law and we're stuck with it.
That's exactly, Tim, that's exactly right. I mean, Social Security is a compulsory old age insurance policy. Mm-hmm. Conservatives say they don't want a compulsory medical insurance policy, but conservative politicians not only don't criticize Social Security, they insist that they will, quote, protect Social Security better than Democratic or liberal politicians. But the point is exactly that if principle is involved, if government requirement of government-required programs like that are what make a program bad, well, conservatives consistently should be opposed not only Social Security, they should want to dismantle Medicare. Medicare, I remember when I was young, when there was talk about introducing Medicare, it was very strongly criticized by conservatives who called it socialized medicine. Now, conservative politicians not only don't criticize it, they insist that they will protect it, quote unquote, better than liberal politicians. And I make the same point as you're making about the Affordable Care Act. Conservatives oppose that. Now, the insistence on repealing or replacing it has died down. There's far less talk about it because once these programs are in place, people get used to them. They benefit from them. They don't really care so much about the cost, and they get accepted even by those who call themselves conservatives and oppose them when they were first introduced.
And Yeah, with these laws, it's as if once they get passed, there's no getting rid of them ever again, and they just give up on them. If I recall, the Obamacare, at least the insurance mandate part of it, the mandated coverage, was actually part of a white paper written at the Heritage Foundation, if I'm not mistaken. So,
well, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
You may be better informed about that than I. But that's not the point. The point is, conservatives said, no, this is a compulsory program. Makes us sign on for something that we should have the right to decide of individually. Okay, well, Social Security is a compulsory program too. They take money out of your wages. You don't have any say in it for your old age retirement. They don't leave that up to the individual. The state says, no, there's an interest in having everybody have some sort of old age insurance, and we're going to make you have it whether you like it or not. Now, I'm not trying to argue whether it's bad or good, whether Social Security is bad or good. Personally, I think something like that is a good thing. The point is, though, that conservatives are inconsistent. They're not principled on these matters, and other matters as well. I also make the point that probably the most highly regarded, quote-unquote, conservative president of recent years or recent decades was Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. But in many ways, he walked back and betrayed promises that he made as a campaigner and pledges he made as a conservative and supported policies very inconsistent with the stances he had taken when he was campaigning, and very inconsistent with what's usually considered the conservative view of these issues, of many issues.
Well, he declared government's the problem, not the solution. So when he left office, government must have been reduced, right? Cut in half, right?
You think. But in fact, he greatly increased government. When he was campaigning, he promised to eliminate programs and departments that he called not only unnecessary but unconstitutional. Specifically, he promised he was going to eliminate the Department of Education. He said the federal government has no right to be involved in education. That's a matter for states or communities, not the federal government. Well, in fact, during the Reagan years, the Department of Education budget increased pretty substantially. He increased the role of the federal government. Ironically, the president in recent years who actually cut back on some more substantially was, of all people, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's the last president who actually had a balanced budget and tried to bring the deficit spending into some kind of control. Ronald Reagan greatly increased deficit spending. Not just increase in military spending, which people kind of expected, I suppose, but he even increased non-military spending during the Reagan years.
Yeah, I believe at the time the Department of Education had only been around for a couple of years. So
that's right.
1979,
that's right.
I think, 79. And so really, if you think about it, there wouldn't be much of a constituency for it at that point. You couldn't even get rid of that, program.
Exactly. Well, I mean, in other words, if somebody was going to take it out and remove it, that was the time and the place to do it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's well entrenched. We're, 30, 40 years on, and it's, of course, gotten even bigger. But that's the point, is that, see, and now I make even a bigger point about immigration. Ronald Reagan's essential outlook on life and philosophy was not fundamentally inconsistent with the liberal democratic outlook that he grew up with during the Roosevelt years. And consistent with, in fact, a candidate now trying to run for president on the basis of the policies and programs of Ronald Reagan would be rejected by American conservatives. That's one of the main points I'm making. I mean, Ronald Reagan's actually signed off on an amnesty, the Simpson-Mazzoli bill that amnestied some 3 million immigrants who were here in the country illegally. And, of course, he also said, well, now we're going to really crack down on those people who do come in illegally. And, of course, the situation has only grown larger since then. Now, any conservative politician today who would even hint at an amnesty program could hardly be elected in America.
He also signed the bill that created the holiday for Dr. Martin Luther King.
Right, and the significance of that especially is that he had pledged not to do that when he was running for president. And the Martin Luther King Day holiday is really a rebuke, a really strong rebuke of conservatism, because Martin Luther King, of course, was anything but a conservative. And one of the an example or a good proof of just how unprincipled many conservatives are is that now many conservative Republicans try to embrace themselves with the legacy of Martin Luther King. That's pretty astonishing to portray themselves as somehow consistent with Martin Luther King, when certainly when he was alive, he was overwhelmingly, in his program and outlook, was overwhelmingly rejected by most Americans who called themselves conservative.
Now, in the article, you raise, I think, a deeper philosophical, fundamental question about the United States, America itself. Reagan saying, a lot of the rhetoric with Ronald Reagan, many conservatives would say that America is a universalist nation. It's a what they say, a proposition nation. It's ideas that matter, not necessarily ethnicity or cultural background, and that it's open to everybody as long as people accept its ideology. And
right.
You say that's a flawed outlook.
Right. That's a more fundamental thing, and that goes to really the core of the article. It comes down to when people talk about conservative, what is it they want to conserve? What people who call themselves conservative really want to preserve is a white America, a European America, or a Christian America. They do have, I think, even though many often are ashamed to articulate it, they have a racial and religious idea of what America is or should be. They don't really accept that America is a country just full of individuals of whatever background or whatever religion or whatever race. And this is fundamentally a question of identity. And right now, America is going through a tremendous turmoil, ultimately based on the question, rooted in the question of identity. What does it mean to be American? What is America? What is America? And this dilemma, this debate is really irreconcilable, because if America is really a universalist country, if America is really a country based on an ideology of equality and democracy, well then the founders of America were really bad guys. The American history is really a shameful one. And that ultimately makes America almost an impossible country to sustain, because the truth is it was founded by European people from Europe who took the land from the people who were already living here. They didn't come here to create the kind of society that conservatives now say America should be. That's the more fundamental question. It's a question of identity and definition. And on that issue, the conservatives are basically the exact same thing as the liberals. They just don't like the consequences of the policies based on the principles they themselves embrace. That's the fundamental problem.
Now, this idea of America as a melting pot and a universalist nation, this kind of developed in the first half of the 20th century, particularly around the First World War. This coincides with America's entry into World War I and Wilsonian rhetoric about the war for, end all wars and war for democracy, make the world safe for democracy and these things. Of course, during the Second World, and you point this out in the article, is the claim made by Why We Fight, the propaganda films, made this universalist claim as well. This is why we're fighting to spread these principles throughout the world. And this sort of undermined the idea of America sort of as a uniquely European civilization.
Right, that's exactly right. Even when America during the First World War is talking about spreading democracy around the world, there was still a more anchored view that that this country should be a European country, that it still had a cultural or racial definition to it. But during the Second World War, that's when it really began changing drastically. America openly emphasized its definition of itself as a universalist society. And that idea of America as a country for everybody, basically, is one that those people who call themselves conservatives in America have come to embrace. And because they embrace it, and liberals embrace it as well, they have very little ground to stand on to resist policies based on that worldview that are pushed more emphatically by liberals than by conservatives. Conservatives don't like the consequences of the very principles they say they believe in.
What's the problem with conservatives embracing the rhetoric of Emma Lazarus?
Well, I point out that at the Statue of Liberty is a very famous poem by a Jewish-American poet and writer named Emma Lazarus. And it proclaims that the Statue of Liberty symbolizes America welcoming everyone from all over the world. And specifically, it talks about welcoming the so-called wretched refuse of your teeming shores. In other words, no matter how downtrodden, no matter how uneducated, no matter how poor, impoverished, or ignorant people are, precisely those people we should welcome and embrace. Now, this isn't language I use. This is language that's on the base of the Statue of Liberty. And conservatives don't object. They think that sounds noble. They don't object to that kind of language. If they did, they would have made some effort to remove that poem and similar sentiments in American life. But they don't. But what conservatives don't like is when people from Somalia or Nigeria or wherever show up in their neighborhood, in their towns. They think the principle sounds noble, but they don't like what the consequences in policy and reality are when those principles are put into effect. And that's one of the problems of conservatives. They sign off on language that sounds quote-unquote noble or admirable, but they don't like the consequences of that. It's very similar to people who say, oh yeah, I believe in a society of equality. We should all, well, a society really of equality is going to have, and we've seen that with the Soviet Union or when the Marxists take over, because they're more emphatic about it. And to a lesser extent, liberals will say they believe in those principles too, and even conservatives will sign off on principles, but they don't like the consequences of what those principles mean in reality in their lives, in the lives of their children, and in the society at large.
Now, immigration itself depends on, of course, the rate of immigration, when it's happening, how much of it is there, and what's going on in the host country at the time. And if you look at America around 1900 and through the 1924, well, that's when they passed the 1924 Immigration Act, which actually put a limit and also emphasized European immigration. So there was a recognition of sort of the importance of ethnic and cultural connection to America. But nevertheless, when Emma Lazarus wrote her poem, there wasn't a welfare state. You had a growing economy. And also America was very decentralized. The decentralization of America has, I think, aggravated these problems because at the time people could have their ethnic neighborhoods, their communities. There wasn't this forced integration, and nor were they tied together through the bonds of the welfare state. And so the people that came here had to work and sort of achieve their own upward mobility. Although there were problems, it was a different alchemy going on at the time. But nevertheless, I think maybe you want to address this, is there's a fundamental shift in the post-war era with this growth of the welfare state, particularly in the 1960s, and also the Immigration Act of 1965. How did that change things?
Right. Well, I mean, the first Immigration Act, the United States immigration law after America became an independent country, welcomed only people of European ancestry, only white people of European ancestry. In the early part of the country, only Christians could vote or hold office. Only white people held office. That was completely understood. Benjamin Franklin, he wanted to keep immigration confined just to people who were from the British Isles. He thought, well, maybe a few Germans could come in, but he didn't even want Swedes coming in. They were too different. And that's changed over time. And America, basically during the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln and others basically wanted a European America. They were a little more vague or imprecise about what that meant, but they were pretty emphatic about how they wanted this to be a white country. And as you mentioned, the Immigration Act of 1924 tried to adjust immigration policy so that the country would stay ethnically, racially, whatever, as it had been, as it is. Although at the time, see, they were somewhat, not exactly shameful, but a little embarrassed about spelling that out too explicitly. Also, for example, when America was first a country, American Indians were not citizens of the United States. They were considered alien and hostile nations, separate from Americans. And it wasn't until the 1920s that most American Indians became U.S. citizens. That's hard to believe. Now we have a situation, of course, in which many white Americans are even rather ashamed of being of European ancestry. I mean, the most prominent example just recently is Elizabeth Warren, who thought it's to her advantage and a source of, I guess, some pride to consider herself an American Indian rather than a European American. Yeah. That's how radically different. Of course, and even under President Nixon and the presidents since then, we've had a range of policies and regulations in the federal government and in universities and education that discriminate against European Americans on the basis that, well, we should all be aiming for a society of equality. Now, that was, of course, completely topsy-turvy from what all Americans, or almost every American, believed in the 18th and 19th century. That's a radically different thing. And very, very few conservatives openly call for the repeal of laws and regulations and practices which discriminate against white Americans. They, in fact, support them. Now, going back to your point, the development of a modern society that is a non-agricultural society has forced us all to act in a more concerted community way that wasn't necessary or required in the early part of American history or the world history, because societies basically consumed only the food that was produced locally. Transportation was difficult. But now we're interdependent. The clothes that we wear might be made not only in another part of the United States, they are very likely made in another continent. The food we eat is very often, or almost always, from someplace outside of our local community. We all require electricity, which is produced in generator plants or hydroelectric plants far, far away from where we are. It's made us, the logic or the reality of modern life creates a greater national or regional ties, creates these ties which were unthinkable when America was a non-industrial society. And of course, welfare is part of the whole question. But the big point I'm making, I guess, or out of all of this, is that the very principles of communitarian principles, including a welfare state and so forth, only really work well when a society is cohesive ethnically, culturally, religiously, or something. It does not work well when a society is multicultural, because some groups benefit more than others, and some people are paying in, and there's a kind of essential injustice to different groups then when that happens. In other words, a welfare state works much better in a country like Denmark, which is overwhelmingly Danish, than it does in a multicultural, large, sprawling country of many different religious or racial or ethnic groups.
Yeah, because you have high trust, and people feel sort of more of an obligation to one another because they come from the same ethnic or cultural background, less corruption, these things, and there's a culture does matter in these things, and
very much so. Yeah, that's part of human beings. But we live in a society today in which many laws are trying to make water run uphill. They run counter to nature. The reality is, I think it's pretty obvious, men and women are different. They're going to act differently in social situations. But American political and to a great extent cultural and social life is based on the notion that with the right amount of adjustment and socialization, men and women are going to be the same. Well, that just flies in the face of human experience through the any ages, through the centuries.
Yeah, it becomes an endless excuse for social engineering, declaring war on nature in these things, and seeing any difference as proof of racism or sexism or some sort of malevolent intent, as opposed to just different groups and different, the two different sexes having different priorities and natures, the same with group differences as well.
Right, yeah. And that's a logical. This kind of craziness is a logical outgrowth of an ideology that's prevailing in America of a kind of hyper-individualism, hyper-egalitarianism, that individuals are replaceable, and that individuals can just be, they're like plastic, and you just mold them into whatever we want. This is contrary to common sense, it's contrary to human experience, it's contrary to history. It can't work. It never has worked, and all attempts in human history to try to create a society like that have inevitably failed because they're based on false premises about what human beings are really like and what life is really like.
Well, it's like the old thing from the French Revolution: equality, fraternity, and liberty, and all. They all sound great, but the only problem is they all contradict one another.
Right.
So it's not practical.
The more liberty there is in the society, the more unequal things are going to be. Yeah, of course, that's exactly true. Yeah. But see, I mean, we're conservatives have a hard time really coming to grips with the underlying principles involved here. In fact, it's kind of an American virtue, if you will, that we don't worry about ideology. We just get the job done. We just deal with problems and issues as they come up. That's kind of a boast that America likes to make about itself. But every country does have an ideology. It has some guiding principles upon which our laws and our regulations and our customs are based. And that's why the ideology, the worldview of a society is very important, and it's incumbent and necessary that the ideology of a society be based on reality, because if it isn't based on reality, the consequences will be horrible, calamitous, disastrous. And that's why, I mean, here we, after 40, 50 years of a certain trajectory in American life, Americans today think, for example, that race relations are worse than they have ever been, or at least for a long time, in spite of the huge efforts that have been made to try to create this egalitarian society that everybody says they want.
Yeah. Now, we're dealing with something that may be, that up to now may be interpreted as sort of the road to hell paved with good intentions. The consequences are just bad ideas, mistakes that have been made, lack of long-term thinking or planning, lack of philosophical outlook in these things, a philosophical and ideological misdirection in the American experiment. There's plenty of that, no doubt. But I do think, and I wonder if you agree with me, that there's also a lot of the stuff is as a result of, I think, malevolence, sort of a planned malevolence to socially engineer America, to fundamentally change it, because we see the same thing occurring throughout the Western world. And it's interesting that what we're seeing with demographics, whether it's weaponized migration and immigration and these things, the breakdown, forced integration and these that we saw, it's a breaking down of community and an imposition of a certain worldview of mixing everyone together. And do you have given any thought to sort of the malevolence behind the past 50, 60 years?
Right. In other words, is the motive of those people pushing for the trajectory that we've been on, who push for these programs, are their motives really laudable and admirable ones, or are they malevolent? Are they how well-intentioned really are these are people behind these programs? That's basically the kind of question you're asking. Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I know, it's hard, it's very difficult to I think, question people's motives. Often individuals are not very really honest about their own motives. And so I think it's a bit presumptuous oftentimes to claim to know the motives of someone else. But having said that, there are some enormous contradictions that make, I think, it obvious that many people who promote a lot of these principles don't really believe them themselves. Now, and I'll give the specific example. One of the organizations that's very influential and powerful in America in pushing for massive immigration, for the idea that diversity is our strength, that this is a country for everyone, is the Anti-Defamation League. This is a very influential Jewish organization. They promote this in schools, in government agencies, in public messages, and so forth. Now, at the same time, I think it's obvious that the Anti-Defamation League is not really sincere about that, because at the same time that they promote these principles for the United States and for England and France and Germany and other countries, they promote precisely the opposite principle for a country they strongly support, namely Israel. Israel is a country that emphatically, overtly says that it's not based upon a principle of universalism. Israel says that it is established to further the interests of a particular ethnic religious group, the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't claim to be a country welcoming everybody. It claims, in fact, that the only people who can develop their own national development and identity in their country is and should be the Jewish people. But a group like the Anti-Defamation League promotes exactly an opposite principle for the American people, or for England, or for, name it, every other country. And that makes it, to me, very obvious that the Anti-Defamation League promotes these principles for reasons that are not really benevolent and not really well-intentioned. They're doing it because I think it's obvious that a group like the Anti-Defamation League's primary goal is to promote what's best for the Jewish people and for Israel, and it is a Jewish organization. Now, that's one reason why I think that that's insincere. Another example of that are American politicians. Nancy Pelosi or the liberal politicians, they claim that, we've got to welcome people. We've got to welcome everybody. America is a propositional country. We should be not concerned about ethnicity or religion, whatever you believe, or whatever you are, that's just fine. But these same politicians are emphatic supporters of Israel and insist that Israel must be defended not just as a country, but specifically as a Jewish, ethnically, religiously Jewish country. They don't make and even permit any kind of support for any other country on that basis. And so, to that extent, I think it's fairly clear that many of the politicians who say that are insincere, and they're not well-intentioned. They're not really honest when they promote these policies for Americans.
Yeah, they're simply responding to the pleadings and threats and payments from AIPAC. That's
right.
why Benjamin
Netanyahu... another way to put it is they really don't have principles. Their main principle is what's good for them as politicians.
Well, they're being very pragmatic, which is very American, right?
Well, then the result is they're doing what's good for themselves as individuals, but not doing what's good for their country or their people or whatever in a larger way.
Yeah, and something like, of course, ADL is their stance is diversity for thee, but not for me, and
right.
I guess those historically, I think those groups like the ADL or World Jewish Outfits organization, organized Jewish groups, tend to support mass immigration or pluralism, perhaps because it tends to weaken the host society, and I guess they've written about this, that actually they think they're safer in that environment, and so they work. Right. And historically, if you look at the groups like Israel and Europe, or any groups, all the organizations that they're overwhelmingly or predominantly Jewish run, And, that's Barbara Specter in Europe, things that she said, and how, she's active. I mean, she actually says the Jewish organization are actually behind what's going on in Europe because they want to break down the ethno-state. So
right.
They're admitting the malevolence. It's just that they're saying it's progressive. Just when you point out to it and you're critical of it, then they call you an anti-Semite because you're pointing out for what they said. It's here.
Right.
It's one of cognitive dissonance we're faced with.
I mean, this is such an obvious example of bad faith, of insincerity, of hypocrisy, and it should be called out. But even to call it out, even to highlight this, brings anybody who does so into just under fire. I mean, they just get called all sorts of names, and this is. But something's changing as America and Europe is ever more in the throes of these problems. It's more and more obvious, I think, to millions and millions of people all over the world. This underlying this huge hypocrisy by organizations like this.
Yeah.
And then that's good, I guess, but it's only happening because there's a huge crisis of the liberal democratic system in the United States and in Western Europe, throughout the Western world, which has, since the Second World War, emphatically embraced the, you might say, liberal democratic worldview. And there's a pushback now going on.
Yeah, and I mean, case in point, myself, which growing up, I didn't really think in ethnic racial terms because I was white. I was in the white majority, and that was just the status quo. But as I've seen the politics changing, the public rhetoric, and sort of what the sphere or Overton window of acceptable opinion gets narrower and narrower, one becomes alarmed of what's going on around you. I mean, you have a situation where I guess European Americans, white Americans, for lack of a better term, white Americans aren't allowed to identify it as such, can't recognize or organize as such, but they're constantly told that they're evil or they're guilty of something. How can they be collectively guilty if that collective doesn't exist? At the same time, groups are, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, are obsessed with the dwindling white majority, the supermajority. Mm-hmm. There was a recent account where there was a documentary on the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Mark Potok was being interviewed in his office, and behind him is a piece of paper that listed the demographics of the country throughout the 20th century. And it's listing, the white majority, 1920, 95%, 1940, 92%, 1960, 85%, 1970, 80%, 1980, 70%. So he's charting the decline, and he's charting it gleefully. Now, that begs the question, because what they're saying is with this changing demographics, what they're saying is that it portends a different culture, a different politics of the nation. The nation will fundamentally change as it gets darker, I guess, or gets more tan, as they say. Well, that is indeed the case. If the politics is going to change because of demographics, then color does matter. You see what I mean?
Right. No, these are good points you're making. I like your phrase, diversity for thee, but not for me.
Yeah.
That's well put. And the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, is a sterling example of this kind of hypocrisy. They think any group that is overt and open about supporting the interests or the identity of white Americans is evil, bad, neo-Nazi, fascist, whatever you want to call it. But they think groups that overtly, emphatically promote Jewish group identity are just fine. They're just wonderful. That's considered just great. And I've put it many times that for groups, and full disclosure here, our group, the Institute for Historical Review, and I are on the SPLC, you might say, roll of honor or dishonor. But I've made the point many times, we don't advocate policy. We don't say you better do this or you should do that. But the Anti-Defamation League is constantly urging specific policies of support for Israel, which just is not just in theory, but in reality, day by day, month after month, year after year, for years, carries out policies of discrimination based on ancestry. But even to talk about it in America in a theoretical way is enough to get one branded and criticized by the SPLC, but actually supporting policies of discrimination based on ancestry by Israel are considered, that's just fine. That's just fine with the SPLC. That's a fundamental hypocrisy, which I think underscores the bad faith and the malign motives behind what the SPLC and groups like that are trying to do.
Yeah, I've mentioned this before in other interviews, but I think you might enjoy this. Adam Winkler, he's a UCLA law professor. He writes a lot about gun control laws, the Constitution. Of course, he's an advocate for gun control, a critic of the National Rifle Association. And I think, and he is Jewish, but he wrote one title of his article is "The Right to Bear Arms Has Mostly Been for White People," which is interesting. But he also wrote an article a few years ago called "The NRA Will Fail. It's Inevitable" for the Washington Post. And here's what he says. Why will it fail? The answer is in the numbers. Support for and opposition to gun control is closely associated with several demographic characteristics, including race, level of education, and whether one lives in a city. Nearly all are trending forcefully against the NRA. The core of the NRA's support comes from white, rural, relatively less educated voters. This demographic is currently influential in politics, but clearly on the wane. While the decline of white, rural, less educated Americans is generally well known, less often recognizes what it means for gun legislation. Polls show that whites tend to favor gun rights over gun control by a significant margin, 57% to 40%. Yet whites, who comprise 63% of the population today, won't be in the majority for long. Racial minorities are seen to be a majority, and they are soon to be a majority, and they are the nation's strongest supporters of strict gun control laws. An overwhelming majority of African Americans say that gun control is more important than gun rights, 72% to 24%. While the African American population shows signs of slow growth, other racial minority groups are growing more rapidly and report even greater support for gun control. The fastest growing minority group in America is Latinos. Between 2000 and 2010, the nation's Latino population grew by 43%. Hispanics, which make up 70% of the population today, are expected to grow to 30% of the population in coming decades. Gun control is extremely popular among Hispanics, with 57% favoring safety over gun rights. Asian Americans also represent a growing anti-gun demographic, although only about 5% of the population today. The Asian American population is predicted to triple over the next few decades. A recent poll of Asian Americans registered voters found that 80% support stricter gun laws. Okay, so if that is indeed the case, this is just one issue. But if having regard for the Second Amendment in particular and the Constitution in general is a white thing, then white people, be they Irish American or German American or mixture, Polish, German, Irish, they have an interest in reversing the demographic trends and maintaining the super white majority, if for nothing else to hold the pass and protect the Constitution and change the politics. If there is a qualitative change in politics based on the nation's demographics with race, then there's a legitimate reason to reverse that trend through whatever means. Yeah.
Yeah, but you'll find many conservatives, I think, taking this utopian and silly view as, well, if we just get the right message, we can get black Americans or Hispanic Americans or whatever to think like we do. And that's never worked, except for a very tiny minority of people. Because, I mean, and it's just utopian. And so that's another reason why, to go back to the main point of this discussion, why conservatives can't win, and they don't win. And because they have their own utopian and unrealistic wishful thinking ideas about America that doom them to just increased impotence. I mean, the essay that I wrote and that's the subject of this discussion doesn't talk about specific politicians or candidates today. I'm not trying to talk about Trump or anybody specific, but right now a tremendous amount of energy is being spent by Rush Limbaugh and the you might say the Trump base about this wall, building this wall. Well, that's good, I guess. I mean, that's fine. That's a good issue. But even if the wall is in place, it will not fundamentally change the demographic, racial, cultural trajectory that the United States is in. It's largely symbolic. I mean, it maybe have some effect. I'm not saying I'm opposing it, but it's really a kind of ultimately a side issue to the larger one of the very definition of America itself.
Well, it's similar in Europe and the United States. You've had a decline in birth rates, smaller families, sort of the transient nature of American society now. This is a function of technology, also social engineering, because as Bill Kaufman said, the invisible hand didn't build the interstate highway system. It was a social engineering plan behind that, and creation of suburbia and these things. And there's an attempt to sort of homogenize America in the 1950s and 60s, for the overall project of the American century. This is the Cold War and these things. And so the white ethnic groups were homogenized in the suburbia, and they lost their ethnic identity, and they become much more vulnerable sort of to the seductions and blandishments of Madison Avenue, of the regime and these things. And so you had sort of the promotion of sexual degeneracy, declining families and these things. So then you have smaller families, lower birth rates, and then they said, well, we need to fill the gap with immigrants to do the labor in these things. And at the same time, you have a Democratic majority that's become increasingly more liberal and with the minorities, and they see immigration and migration sort of as a way to swell the welfare rolls and build their base. And then you have the Republicans who savor or salivate over cheap labor. but
right.
In that calculation, no one gives the long-term thought to the stability of the community and to the native population. What effect does it have? Because people want to have cheaper landscaping, labor, or they don't want to pay more for their roofs or something. So they're going to bring in cheap labor, from the third world, and not think about the long-term consequences of these things. Not to mention the fact that what we're talking about often with immigration and sort of the malevolent planning. Okay, this is an example of what's being done. This is social engineering. It's malevolent. At the same time, the native white population has also allowed itself to be seduced into narcissism and the consumerism, which has led to the situation where they need to go out, be less materialistic, less consumerist, and have more babies, quite frankly, and then stable families. Stable families.
Well, Tim, you put your finger on I think that's very well articulated. You've raised very good points. You've expressed it very well. You see, that's part of the problem. I think there's a kind of original sin of American history, and I mean it's both a virtue and a vice. And what it is the emphasis on the short term and the here and now and what's good for me right now. That's always been a major feature of American life from the very beginning. People who came here already in the 18th century from Europe and settled in Jamestown and Massachusetts and so forth, they were not concerned about the long term. They cut down the forests. They exhausted the soil because there was always more. They killed the buffalo in huge numbers because there was always more land. America was had such an abundance of land, forests, animals, minerals, harbors, and so forth, that it wasn't necessary to give long-term thinking to how this is all going to play out. And a very good example of that is that, underscoring this, is that every one of the early founders of America were very aware that there would be long-term calamitous consequences to bringing in black slaves from Africa as cheap labor. They all understood that. Jefferson understood. They all knew this is not going to end well. This is not going to be good. But they all did it anyway, or they went along with it. Jefferson himself owned slaves, even though he warned this is not going to be good because it was good in the short run. And doing what's good in the short run was, of course, quite the thing to do, quite understandable, when America just had such an abundance and the continent was here virtually for the taking. I mean, the only opposition were very primitive, non-industrial, non-developed Indians who couldn't hold up against machine guns and rifles and American power, and that's understandable. But that short-term emphasis, that emphasis on what's good for the here and now, for the short term, is a catastrophe for a developed society. And in that regard, it's very interesting that Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John Marshall was the first Justice of the Supreme Court. Jefferson was the third president of the United States. John Adams was the second president. In their later years, after they were president, in the early part of the 19th century, each of them predicted that, they all understood these problems, and they predicted America will have about a century of a good run before these problems are going to start really taking hold in America. And you could say, well, maybe a century and a half or something. But they understood that as long as there was an open frontier, as long as there was always more, as long as America had a kind of escape valve, we could put off these problems. Now these problems cannot be put off. And one of the features of a modern society is that if something is going to be held in place, if something's if you want something to happen, it has to be overt. It has to be explicit. It can't be just taken for granted. In a modern society, not even the air we breathe can be taken for granted. And that's a feature of modern society that runs counter to the kind of, laissez-faire, it'll all work out kind of attitude that was understandable and which worked for, you might say, the first half of American history.
Yeah, because it works for several decades doesn't mean it's necessarily the right approach. It just, in the short term, it seems to work.
Well, it worked.
Yeah.
It worked for reasons which were objective reasons of the time, which are no longer the case. When America had, during the early part of the 19th century, basically kind of open borders, anybody who came here could become an American. The only people that did come and were able to come in large numbers were from Europe in the early 19th and beginning of the 20th century, because the rest of the world didn't have the technology. Now anybody can come in, anybody can get on a plane. It's open. The technology has changed that reality.
Yeah, and someone's paying for it, though, right?
Well, yes, that's right.
You don't get 50,000 Somalis in Minnesota, but for them walking. Someone plopped them
right.
there.
Well, no, that's true too.
Yeah.
Well, now, I don't want to downplay the fact that that's part and parcel of American policy.
Yeah.
Another aspect of it too is that many of these people who come here are the, you might say, the results of these calamitous, ridiculous American wars. After the Vietnam War, then the United States let in all sorts of Vietnamese who had sided with the United States, and their lives are ruined unless they got out. And so communities of Hmong people or Montagnards, which Americans hardly even knew what that was until the Vietnam War, suddenly they're showing up in America. By the same token, people who sided with America in Afghanistan, well, now things are gone bad, and so America feels a kind of, or many people, I guess, feel a responsibility to let them come here because their lives have been ruined, as it were. Their futures have been ruined if they stay in their own country.
Yeah.
That goes along with that because of course, I believe strongly that America's role as this kind of policeman of the world and trying to change societies around the world is just as utopian in Afghanistan as it is here in this country. Mm-hmm. Even more so, I should say. It's even more utopian, I guess, but and unrealistic. But anyway, that's part and parcel of this outlook toward the world that America has, which I think is unrealistic, and internally as well. And again, this isn't something just confined to liberals. Conservatives claim to believe in the same principles, but they object and complain about the consequences of those principles. And there's very little that the average American, because there's very little leadership for any of this, to do about it. A couple of years ago, as you well know, the population in Britain voted to leave the European Union. Mm-hmm. Now, they did that because it was almost the only way people in Britain could express their frustration at what's happened to their society. Now, Britain may leave the European Union, although that's become a problem, but that's not really what they're concerned about. They're not concerned so much about leaving the European Union. They want Britain to be the way it used to be. They want it to be a white country. They want it to be the Britain that it had been for centuries. And this is the only way to express it. And by the same token, white Americans are very, very frustrated about the trajectory and trends in this country over the past 40, 50 years, and they voted for Donald Trump. And they got Donald Trump, but the essential cultural and demographic trends have not really changed fundamentally in this country. But that's the only way that people can voice their frustration. So anyway, those are some added points to what you've been making, I think.
Yeah, much of what we take for granted as sort of common sense America, with the values of fair play, rule of law, and these things, this is a sort of a European cultural artifact. It's transplanted to America, and what we associate as decent public life, an orderly public square, is not going to be possible if America, if the super white majority goes down to 40% and it becomes diverse, as the ADL would call for, because it becomes unmanageable. You have low trust. A good example of that is if you saw, it was on YouTube, that you had a restaurant, I think it was Chipotle. Now, Chipotle has a business model where you come in and you order, you build your own meal, and you order it down the line, and you pay when you get to the end of it. It's presented to you, and you pay the cashier. And in Minneapolis, St. Paul, they've had tens of thousands of Somalis come in the past 20 years. The U.S. courtesy of the U.S. government and various NGOs, and they've created a community there, an area of Somalia. So in the middle of this area that was primarily, I guess, Swedes, for the longest time, these Somalis now they're creating certain problems with crime, and there's a thing called dine and dash, and this is the second generation, the teenagers, to come in and they order the meals, and then they just run out with the food. Yeah. And there was a video of it where a group of these young men were doing this, and the manager refused to take their order until they paid first. And then it's kind of funny because this is a first generation immigrant family, and this young man knew all the rhetoric of racism and these things. He picked everything up, all the claims of grievances, and started saying, "You're a racist." They had it on film. He had his phone out. And at the same time, there's like a middle-aged white gentleman who gets to leave. And why does he get to leave? And it's because he pays and you don't. And Chipotle immediately fired the manager as soon as this video was posted. Well, it turns out that someone has a video. This young man had posted on Facebook bragging about they'd done this to various restaurants throughout the area. And so this is a breakdown again of trust. And so pretty soon, if this keeps going on, people aren't going to have that service available in the city anymore because of crime.
Right. I mean, the whole thing will break down.
Yeah.
But you're alluding, I think, without mentioning it, to this famous study by this sociologist named Putnam, who was shocked to find, after extensive surveys and research and investigation, that the more multicultural or more multi-ethnic or more multiracial a society is, the lower levels of trust, not just between people of different groups, but even among people of the same background. Levels of trust start plummeting because people don't have a healthy society is not just based on contractual law or rules. It's based on a certain mores and understanding of behavior that we don't have to spell out in regulations and laws. And that breaks down when a society becomes multicultural, because those underlying assumptions about how people ought to be begins to break down. And millions of white Americans have this, I think, delusional idea that, well, if we're just nice to everybody, it'll all work out. This is childish. This is foolishness, but this is a very, very widespread view here in the United States. And again, the big problem is that a huge problem in America is we have people who try to talk frankly and truthfully about these realities are shouted down and called names, and people who spout noble-sounding but ludicrous nonsense about society and history and so forth are praised and elevated. And this is this is a society that's just lost its moorings. It's lost its grip on reality, and this last election, 2016, the last presidential election, is the first in American history in which a majority of the population, majority of the voters, said they didn't trust either of the candidates of either of the two major parties. Polls have been showing for years these unprecedented levels of distrust of our Congress, the presidency, the media, our major institutions. A society with those high levels of distrust is a fundamentally sick society, a society that is not going to be able to survive when it faces a really severe crisis.
Yeah. And a good example of that was in the State of the Union address, when President Trump mentioned all the progress that he made on behalf of blacks, Asians, and women, I guess as distinguished from men. But there's no discussion of how things have gone well for white Americans or white men, even though it's still a substantial portion of the country and white Americans being the majority. It's just presumed that majority simply doesn't matter. It's not a concern for policy. In fact, policies are designed to actually work against them in many respects. But there's this notion of white privilege that's out there, right? There's these things, and there's no discussion of the problems that do exist in some of the minority communities. High crime, illegitimacy, 80% illegitimacy rate in these things, and these are going to lead to predictable pathological behaviors and problems in those communities. But there's no, even he said in the speech that, he talked about more women are working than ever before. I don't know if that's a good thing, because then who's taking care of the babies? Who's having the babies?
Yeah.
They're not having babies. Yeah. And that's the thing is, if you talk about demographic decline, there's immigration, there's illegal immigration, there's weaponized migration, but preceding that is the rapid decline in the white birth rate, the European birth rate.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that there's several obvious factors behind that. One is, of course, the big emphasis on doing what's good for me and not even really considering the future. Another is that white people have been told that, well, we have too many people anyway, and it doesn't matter whether people are white or black, and there's plenty of people coming in, so children aren't even necessary. That's another aspect of it. This is happening throughout the white world, which has been told collectively for years, well, the white race is responsible for all these terrible things happening in the world, and it's not hard to draw from that. Well, better not bring any more white people in the world. You probably have seen, and we put on our website articles showing that the white suicide rate has gone up. It's high. Because people have lost any sense of their own worth, really, as white Americans, bombarded as we are with propaganda and conditioning that says, well, white people are responsible for all the terrible things that are happening. We're told over and over that white people do well because they've been bad to other people. Well, that's just it's untrue. It's wrong. But the impact of for a society of telling people that year after year cannot help but be just catastrophic.
Yeah, and if you look at statistics, there's a color crime report. When you look at who's responsible, disproportionately responsible for rapes and murders, it's a completely different picture, and it raises other questions about the problems that, basically people are ignoring the real problems and not addressing it and dealing with this fantasy of racism and these things. And we've seen that lately, with this idiot, was it Jussie Smollett, who apparently faked this crime and these things, how immediately politicians, just assumed it was true and said, we need to fight this. This is America in 2019. Someone said it's racist, and it turns out it probably was a hoax. And so many things are hoaxes because the media just immediately they have a ready-made response. There's never any skepticism because it fits the narrative of evil white people. And
they have to do that because how they have to come up with an explanation which everybody can see that there are obvious large gaps between achievement of different racial groups. Mm-hmm. Well, how do we explain this? What's the explanation? The only explanation that's permitted, politically correct in our society, is white racism. And so the media is eager to find whatever examples of that they can highlight to justify this narrative of American society. This is a fundamental problem. But again, I want to go back to another point. It doesn't matter in a way, whether a society is high achieving or low achieving, or whether it's productive or not so productive, every group has a right to its own identity, no matter who they happen to be. And that's a truism that people throughout the ages have understood. But in America, that basic reality is denied and excoriated and criticized and blackened, and it runs counter to history and nature and reality. I mean, nobody. It's odd to me. I've always thought it's amusing that liberals, many of them, think free self-determination for Tibet is very important. Tibet should be an independent country. They shouldn't be overwhelmed with the Chinese. But they don't have the same concern about whether Poland or Denmark or Norway are overrun. But Tibetan, I mean, it's a kind of a condescending kind of concern for the self-determination of people far, far away from our own shores and our own borders, but a lack of a similar principle with regard to groups here closer to home.
Yeah, and it's you can't transport 500,000 Africans into Sweden and expect Sweden to remain Sweden.
That's right. Well, of course, it's so obvious. I mean, there wouldn't be a United States of America. I mean, if America had not been founded by Europeans, if Europeans had not moved here in the 16 and 1700s, and it had been settled by people from Africa or Asia, it'd be a completely different country.
Yeah.
And it's obvious to everyone. I mean, anybody who gives it the slightest amount of thought should know this. But we're told over and over that this is all just kind of an accident of history, that Jefferson was just a smart guy who came up with this principle of equality, and that's what this is just madness. I mean, crazy. But it's a principle. It's an idea that even conservatives embrace. That's what they say, and of course, liberals say the same thing, and it's wrong in the same way. And it's, again, to go back to the main theme, it's a reason why conservatives can't win, because not even their thinking isn't even self-consistent and thought out.
Well, it's if you're advocating policies which erode and destroy, what indeed are you advocating to conserve? Yeah, so,
that's the point. The question I ask: what does the conservatives want to conserve? Because the kind of America that white Americans want to live in, whether they call themselves liberal or conservative, is a society that's culturally Western and racially European. That's the reality. And in fact, oftentimes I ask people, well, leaving aside the United States of America, what country would you want to live in? Well, conservatives never choose a low government country. They never say Somalia or Haiti would be wonderful. They always choose countries that also have very intrusive governments, gun control laws, high taxes, but they're white. And liberals, they never choose a multicultural society. They always choose New Zealand, Scandinavian countries. They always choose white countries too, countries that are supposedly inflicted with the sin of white privilege. I mean, it just underscores the myopia, I guess, of millions of Americans, whether they call themselves liberal or conservative.
Yeah, and if they have the wherewithal, white Americans, conservative and liberal, will live in areas that are vast majority white. Where the schools are good.
Reason.
They use euphemism. They say where the schools are good, and what they're saying is it's white. It's a white area.
Well, it's one of the reasons why overwhelmingly white Americans regarded Hillary Clinton in the last presidential election as just a complete hypocrite. She talks about how she's for everybody, but she lives in a rarefied world of her own, a world of privilege, a world of people that can afford gated communities and guards and people to protect them. The ideal world that she claims to be in favor of isn't for her to live in, it's for everybody else to have to live in. And that's so obvious to everyone that nobody really believed Hillary Clinton and trusted her. And it's one of the reasons why even Democrats if there had been a fair playing field, they wouldn't have supported her. She didn't. But anyway, this is a big problem even among liberal whites and among Democrats as well as Republicans and conservatives.
Yeah, and if you want to retain or conserve or even return to day of America, that seemed more sensible, maybe the 50s and 60s, you're going to have to somehow get back to the demographics that reflected that. And that's, some people are hard to, because we've been brought up again in that idea of where it's race doesn't matter, it's color blindness and these things, and these are nice sentiments, but in reality, if you can have an America that retains its constitutional moorings and its heritage, it's going to have to retain a super white European majority, and that's
right.
and why I'm saying is because the other side admits that. With that article I set up by Adam Winkler, they admit that, right, in their rhetoric when they talk about changing color of America, changing the politics. Okay, so you're admitting that it does matter, so then it's a valid position to take, or a position to position to take is that, okay, if that does indeed matter, then I don't like your politics. If that's what it means, then we better do something to reverse this and change it, and whatever that entails. Which I would say sort of a renaissance or a revitalization of the idea, sense of community, sacrifice, this end of narcissism and consumerism, these things, the ability to sacrifice. That usually means putting aside the vacation or the consumerism and these things, and having more kids and being, say, maybe moving less. I think the average American family moves once every 4 years. And how do you maintain a community in that? So we're kind of atomized, and when we're atomized, we're weaker. We have no community to rely upon to fight, the New World Order, for lack of a better, the oligarchs, the ruling elite that manipulate us so much. And so but it's sort of a Faustian bargain that we in the West, particularly America, with technology and consumerism and mobility and these things. So it's hard for most people to even recognize, because they get seduced by it. They're born into it. They become adjusted to it. Right.
No, this is you're touching on some very good points. And again, we're going back to something you said earlier. This emphasis on rights and a kind of narcissistic, individualist, self-centered view is death to the long-term welfare of well-being of any community, any society, and a society can crank along for a long time being like that, but when it faces real crises or so forth, it'll fold, and that's what American society is doing right now. I mean, I'm not alone. I mean, many people have drawn parallels between the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd century and America today. Roman citizenship in the 1st century BC meant something. It wasn't given to everybody. It was originally the only citizens were people of the Latin tribe of one particular group, and it expanded and so forth. But by the 2nd century AD, everybody was a Roman citizen. It was a universalist society. There was a lot of mumbling and unhappiness about the direction it was going. In order to sustain this increasingly top-heavy society, taxes had to go up. The Senate, representative government fell apart, and increasingly it was in the hands of demagogues and people who were able to sway the mass of people in Rome. I mean, the parallels are so obvious, and they go with other empires and societies too that have undergone the similar kinds of trajectory that the United States and the Roman Empire have gone.
Yeah, and then along came the barbarians, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, somebody's going to come in. Something's going to happen. It just doesn't go along forever. And there's that's part of the sense of gloom. It's interesting that American motion pictures that are futuristic don't portray a future that's very, very attractive. It's pretty grim. Mm-hmm. However, whatever you want to, there's catastrophes, or it's like Blade Runner, or I mean, these are people vaguely sense this, that as things continue to move along in the direction they have been for the last 30 or 40 years, it's not going to be good. I mean, anybody who's been in almost any part of the country who's over the age of 30 or 40 has seen changes in his lifetime, and of course I'm older than that, so I've seen even greater changes. And society is uglier, it's coarser, it's more contentious, it's grittier. Those are all obvious to everybody, and that's reflected in public opinion polls. People don't like. Now, it might be more attractive. American society might still be very attractive for people from Somalia or Burma and Syria, especially if you're in the middle of a war.
Yes.
But it's not attractive to the people who've been living here for a long period of time. You know, it's amazing. Young people, young Americans are told in school and encouraged to believe that the 1950s was some dark, oppressive, horrible time in American history. Well, that's not how Americans themselves looked at it. Americans who lived during that period, and I was a child during the 50s, it was a tremendously optimistic period. A tremendously expansive period in American history. And people didn't think they were oppressed or things were bad. They thought it was great. But we're now told, no, that was a very dark period in American history, and the 40s were bad, and blah, blah, blah. This is all really a complete distortion of the reality of American life.
Yeah, it was all racist and bad. There was no growth or that was the baby boom. That's usually a sign of high morale and faith in the future.
Well, in fact, it was probably the longest sustained period of economic growth, prosperity, and optimism in certainly in American history, or perhaps in the world. I mean, there's objective reasons why that was. It was because the rest of the world had been destroyed in the Second World War. I mean, one friend of mine said, it was in the import-export business. He said you could put anything on an American ship and send it overseas, and it gets sold. You can't do that now. Other countries are making products that are either cheaper or better than the United States on a whole range of things. But in the 50s, America was top dog because Asia was in ruins, Japan was in ruins, China was in civil war, Europe had been destroyed, Russia was in ruins. I mean, and now that's all changed. The world has developed, and those are objective reasons why that reality has changed.
It's kind of funny because that's usually the British Empire supposedly believed in free trade, and so did America until it reverses.
Well, the British Empire, I mean, that was one of the reasons why the Second World War happened, was the British Empire had a closed system. It was free trade within the British Empire. But people outside of it, then it's one of the reasons why Japan felt tremendously constricted, because it had no oil and petroleum of its own, and it was dependent upon importing it from elsewhere. And the rest of the world has sort of been locked up by the British and the French and the Dutch empires and so forth. I mean, I don't want to go back through World War II, but anyway, there's reasons why these things happen, and it's not just that, like many people think, well, they were just better, or we're better, or no, that's a self-centered and childish view of looking at things.
Yeah, that's the problem with. I mean, you say America's a nation of immigrants and these things, as if these are universal standards. Well, as times change, policies should change. As conditions, objective conditions change, there's time to reconsider these things. So the immigration rate of 1898 might not be appropriate for America 2019. It's
right. It goes back to the point earlier about how America was essentially an empty continent. When California became a state in 1850, there were something like 30,000 people in the entire state of California. 30,000. I mean, that's just incredible. The Indian population was very small. The Mexican-Spanish population was infinitesimal practically. There were some white people. 30,000 people in an area as large as Western Europe practically. That's just incredible. And so America could afford, and understandably, lots of people came in, and it didn't seem to matter very much. It didn't matter all that much. That's all changed now. Yeah,
and as much the talk there is about illegal immigration, people should start talking about legal immigration too, because that needs, it's not as if.
Well, these are really fundamental. To go back to an earlier point, it's a question of identity. What does it mean to be American? Basically, liberals, or the liberal narrative of America, is this is a country for everyone. And as I pointed out in the essay that prompted this discussion, Ronald Reagan embraced this idea. We're this universal country. Well, does that mean everybody has a right to come here? I mean, what does that mean in real terms? Is citizenship a right or is it a privilege? And if it's a privilege, on what basis? Those questions. But see, it sounds nice. Reagan made everybody sound good. Feel good. I mean, he sounded good. And conservatives especially applauded rhetoric of Ronald Reagan that. They didn't really understand what that was going to mean in practical terms when those nice sounding words are put into effect.
Yeah, a while back I read a book called The Political Meaning of Christianity. This was like 28 years ago. I was a very young man, by Grant Tinder, I think was the article, and he talked about the importance of the Christian influence on the political development of the West and its institutions in Europe and the United States. And he made a good point. I think this is a sort of the sort of the cross section between Rome, Jerusalem, and Athens. This is the West. I say this because if you have a country that's overwhelmingly Christian, it can and European, it can tolerate minorities, right? 5, 6, 7, even 10, 12% in these things. Well, the numbers do matter, and so if you have a 3% Muslim population amongst 90% Christian population. That minority is going to, it's going to behave. It's not going to create too much trouble, even if there's a cultural problem. But if you have 40, 50% Muslim population, then it becomes a completely different political dynamic. And that's the difference. I mean, we can sit back and say we can be universalist if we're the supermajority because the way society operates just by sheer numbers seems to work. But if the numbers change with that different culture, then you'll see the difference. Good example, if France becomes 50, 60% Muslim because of low birth rates and immigration, it's no longer France anymore. If you know the history of France, right, the Battle of Tours, it's not going to be France anymore. Right. And so, nor would Sweden be Sweden. And so, this is what we're talking. We're talking about the existence of peoples and their nations to exist. And when you talk about open immigration, no borders, you're talking about the destruction of nations. And this is the organizational way that people have themselves represented, have their interests represented. So what they're saying is when people like Peter Sutherland, the late Irish oligarch who did so much to destroy Ireland, or people like General Wesley Clark talk about the day of the European nation ethnic state is over, as if somehow he's been coronated or anointed the Commissar of Nations. He's a right to declare that, but he was the head of NATO when he said this, and they were in the process of doing that to Yugoslavia. The point being is, these again, the way that people organize, if the state organizes along ethnic grounds, like particularly Germany or France, and you change its demographics, America's, as we've talked all night, it's a different story. But at the same time, if you to change the demographics through immigration, you're destroying the country. You're destroying those people.
Yeah. Well, you destroy it in any meaningful way. Essentially, the idea that these people have is that the name Germany should mean no more than the name North Dakota.
Yeah.
That it describes an area. France should mean nothing more than Arizona, their administrative districts. And it doesn't matter who lives there. But this is completely contrary to something very fundamental about human beings. Human beings are not just individuals. We are social beings. Our identity, our sense of purpose, our meaning in life derives in large measure from our identity as social beings, as members of something beyond ourselves. We're not just individuals. And the idea that society can just be a collection of individuals is just contrary to what makes human beings human. The idea that the nation state is going to be eliminated runs counter even to the history of the 20th century. If modern history teaches anything, it's the fragility of multicultural, multi-ethnic states.
Yes.
We saw the breakdown of the Soviet Union along national lines. It was national feeling that was the main motor that broke up the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia busted apart and it became Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and so forth. And it was a rather benign society compared to the Soviet Union, of course. I mean, we've seen the emergence of South Sudan from North Sudan. We've seen, this is a reality, is that people want to live in societies run by people like themselves and in societies living among people like themselves. This is a very human thing, and there's nothing to be ashamed of about that. And to call it racism or other belittling words like that only obscures and denies something very basic and fundamental about human beings and about what makes us human.
Mm-hmm. So, well, I think we covered it.
We covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
Tim. Thank you. You're a great host. We
you.
bounce off each other, I think, well. I think we've covered a lot, and I'm very pleased you put things very well yourself, and I'm happy to be with you.
No, thank you. So, Mark, where can people follow your work? Was the best way to?
Well, they can follow my work best by going to the website ihr.org, Institute for Historical Review. The essay I wrote on why conservatives can't win is a little off that, and that's why it's on the UN's Review website. Of course, I gave it at a meeting we had here in October, and then I sort of refined it and worked on it, and it's gotten a good bit of traffic ever since. But I encourage people to check out, of course, our website. But the work of, I basically call it, just a healthy awareness of reality is going on nonstop all over and growing all over the Western world. And I'm very happy to be with you because you're an important person in helping this important process.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I'll let you go. And, go get some dinner or something out there in the West Coast. So.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Tim.
When I post this, I'll send you the link. It'll be very soon. So.
Great. Thanks a lot, then.
Good night, then. Bye-bye.
Hey, bus driver, keep a change. Bless your children, give them names. Don't trust man who walk with canes. Drink yes and you'll grow wings on your feet. Won't we marry Joe Fontaine? Advertiser on a downtown train. Christmas riot, Boston cane, she's in love again. Well, dock workers' dreams mixed with Panther schemes to someday own the rodeo. Tainted women in Vista Vision perform for out-of-state kids at the Late Show. Wizard imps, sweat sock pimps, interstellar mongrel nymphs. Well, now Rick said that lady left him lamp. Oh, love is like that. Queen of diamonds, ace of the spades, newly discovered lovers of the Everglades. They take out